green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Небо утреннего стяг в жизни важен. Первый шаг, слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening at 8 o'clock of the 8th of December 2023, and we begin tonight with an extended look at the Essequibo controversy, should we say, long-running border dispute. That is what we're going to be turning to first, before turning to some news about events in Russia and elsewhere. So, we will begin, of course, by a customary roll call through the chat. So, hello to Oz, Banana Bender, James Graham, RVA Klavic, Jay, Karen, YepX, good afternoon to you, and Mutanda and Arnold, and good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, and good evening to Jerry. Yuan, good evening to you out there in Jordan, and DE, and Stanislav Tomov, who's joining us from Bulgaria, and Philbin from Rhode Island, USA. CP, good evening to all, says this person, and good evening to them right back. Karen says RIP to Shane McGowan, and RIP indeed, a great man, a great musician, a great Irish poet, and a great supporter of the Irish Republican cause. He will, of course, be missed. And be sure to go out and listen to the original Fairy Tale of New York, not the lame edited version they used to play in the supermarkets that I worked in as a kid. And Irish Partisan says, on this day in 1922, the Irish Republican Army leader and revolutionary socialist Liam Mellows was executed by the reactionary Free State Forces. And of course, the reactionary Free State Forces operate on behalf of British imperialism. They did then, they do now. So a red salute to the memory of Liam Mellows and all those who died to advance the cause of Irish freedom, though it is, of course, a cause which has not yet been completed in the struggle. And David Green, good evening to you. And Tim Gray, good evening to you. Right. We will begin tonight with an extended look at the Essequibo affair. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, this, as I was until a couple of weeks ago, to be completely honest, the border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana, formerly known as British Guyana, that revolves around a region in the far east of Venezuela, that has been claimed by the various different iterations of the Venezuelan Republic since the earliest incarnation of it, the very first republic. And the whole question of this is that, well, what is actually the case here? Does Venezuela have a case? Is this a case of petropopulism, imperialism, as Naomi Klein might say? But to demonstrate why I think that not only is there a case, but it's a pretty strong one, and it's one that which leaves British and US imperialism pretty damn guilty, or looking pretty damn guilty, we have to turn to a series of maps which I'm going to go through, and hopefully this will demonstrate the historical validity of Venezuela's claim. So first one up, I'm going to pull up a map which is of historical significance, really. It's from 1635, and it's a map I'm going to put on the screen there. Hope you can all see it. This is a map of the Spanish colony of Venezuela as it was constituted in 1635, and you can see there, of course, with some slight geographical inaccuracies. You can see on the eastern side of the map there, you can see the island of Trinidad, which was taken over by British imperialism in the 18th century. And you can see a series of islands there, which in 1635 were almost all under the rule of the Spanish imperial state. And the islands you can see across the top of what's now Venezuela there, a lot of those were seized by the Dutch and turned into slave trading ports. The area on the eastern side of the map, immediately underneath Trinidad and around there, these are the areas that were later seized by British imperialism. And so I'm showing this to establish that the Venezuelan state, of course, claimed independence from the Spanish and ultimately sought to inherit the colonial era borders with some complications, which I'll go into in a moment. But in this period, in the early 17th century, you can see that all this used to be considered part of the colonial era of Venezuela. So that's the first map to get out of the way. So all of the territory under discussion today, all of the various different bits of it, long before they were seized by the British and the Dutch, all used to be part of the territory of the Spanish colonial iteration of Venezuela, including Trinidad, which was seized by the British later, as I've already said, and a lot of the islands in the Caribbean that were later regarded as French and Dutch and British colonial possessions, including islands like Jamaica, were all originally seized by the Spanish. So that's our first historical map to give some indication as to how far back we have to go here. The second one, which I'm going to flip to now when I've just made a quick adjustment. There we go. This is a map of the more established later colonial state, and this is the map of Venezuela with some relevance to the case we're talking about tonight, because you can see, again, if you look at the eastern part of the map, and you can see on the far eastern side of Venezuela, as it is constituted there, this is the colonial map of Venezuela based on the colonial borders of the later 18th century. You can see the land that hangs down on the eastern side of Venezuela there, the Essequibo region. That is a large part of the territory that's under discussion, that's under dispute. So in this period of time, in the later 18th century, in the period immediately before the Napoleonic Wars blew up the European system and was the trigger for the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution, and the effects of the American Revolution, proved to be the trigger for the series of independence wars that kicked off in South America and in Central America. So you can see there the overhang bit in the east of the country there, that's Essequibo, that's the territory under discussion. And in that colonial period, in the period immediately before the independence campaigns begin, that was regarded as a part of the borders of the Spanish colonial state that existed there at the time. So that's the one thing to establish. The other thing I will mention at this stage, and I'm just going to get rid of that there, is that these borders, the reason why the British and the Dutch, particularly the British, were able to manipulate them in the way that they had done was because, of course, that Essequibo region was subject to, no real control by the colonial authorities or the later First and Second Republics of Venezuela. And that, of course, gave the British an opportunity because there was no real border control and there was no real, other than some sparsely populated indigenous tribes to whom the borders didn't mean a great deal anyway, there was no machinery there to enforce the claims of the Venezuelan state, leaving it wide open, of course, to infiltration by the British and taking over by the British. Excuse me. So here's the borders of the First Venezuelan Republic, I'm going to call up next. And this is a map based on the first war of the War of Independence fought by Bolivar and others. And this one's marked out divisions between royalists and patriots. I'm getting this one up because this is the one I could find showing the borders as considered by the First Venezuelan Republic. Back in the very early 19th century when the Napoleonic Wars in Europe are still going on. And again, you can see it's transposed over the modern borders there to a degree. You can see there, again, on the eastern side of the country, you can see the Essequibo region hanging down there. Again, considered part of the First Venezuelan Republic, controlled on this map by the royalists, by the Spanish loyalists at this stage. This is around about 1811 when this map is based on. So again, the earliest iteration of the Venezuelan Republic also considered Essequibo to be an integral part of the country. So we'll move it on then to I couldn't find an accurate map of the Second Republic, but here's the Venezuelan Third Republic. Again, patriots and royalists, the position is somewhat reversed here. But you can see again, this is a map of the Third Venezuelan Republic, and this map shows very clearly that, again, the Essequibo region is considered to be an integral part of the Third Venezuelan Republic. You can see there up above there, you can see Trinidad, which is of course the British colony, and you can see off to the east there, that's what's now, well, that's the territory of Guyana proper. Now, next to that is Suriname, and across from that is French Guiana. Now, of course, Suriname, a Dutch colony, used to stretch up to what's now the borders of what was formerly known as British Guiana. The British essentially strong-armed the Dutch into giving them that in 1814 in order that they could keep a firm foothold in South America and thus prevent the emergence of any strong independent South American states that might conceivably be a threat to British interests. So that's the Third Venezuelan Republic that you've been looking at there. We now move to a look at a rather more artistic map. This is the map of the borders of the country known as Gran Colombia in some descriptions. And this is, of course, a much bigger territory. And if you look it up, you look at the map there, you can see that this was a territory, a country, in fact, that stretched over a much wider territory than, of course, Venezuela does now. But you can see here, on the edge here, on the eastern edge, you can see that they consider what's now the Essequibo region to be part of Gran Colombia. Now, this is in the early 1820s, and there's already a dispute with the British in the Gran Colombia period, which, of course, had Bolivar as one of the integral leaders of the Gran Colombia state. And it was Bolivar's dream, his most profound aspiration in some respects, was to have as much unity as possible amongst these former Spanish colonies. He wanted to unify as many of them as possible into one state, and that's what the decade or so of Gran Colombia was. So here you can see the borders of Venezuela, modern-day Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, and I think elements of Costa Rica as well, modern-day Bolivia, bits of what is now Brazil, and ultimately they managed to liberate Peru and wanted to incorporate that as well. I haven't got time to go through all the reasons why Gran Colombia fell apart, but British machinations were certainly part of it. None of the imperialist countries wanted to see this big a country succeed as a strong and stable, even a bourgeois republic. So the key thing is, though, that this is another iteration of the Venezuelan state, this confederation of the different states that emerged from the old Spanish Empire. And you can see that the Essequibo region is considered to be part of that state, even though it says on the map, disputed with the British, as it says further down, disputed with the Empire of Brazil, as Brazil was known as back then. So final piece of cartography for you this evening is a map from 1890. This is Venezuela as it was constituted in 1890. And this is relevant to our case because one of the key disputes that is mentioned in a lot of the coverage of this event is the court case in 1899, or I should say the arbitration case in 1899 between the British and the Venezuelans, where the issue of Essequibo was arbitrated. And the one you can see here, you can see again that the Venezuelans in the 1890s considered the Essequibo region, again on the eastern side of this map, to be an integral part of the state. So the whole question of the Essequibo region has been an on-running issue ever since the independence of the first Venezuelan Republic, ever since the rise and fall of Gran Colombia. And there was a period when the early Venezuelan government thought that it had secured recognition of its borders from the British in 1814 when the British established British Guyana. But the British never respected that agreement. they always violated it. They always sought to expand into the Essequibo region, which of course has a lot of very valuable resources in it, apparently, including gold and of course the famous offshore oil deposits, which had been the subject of the current controversies between, well, nominally between Maduro and the Guyanese, but also ultimately between the Venezuelans and U.S. imperialism. So this 1890s map I've just shown, of course, this is what part of what informs us about the arbitration case, which was heard in 1899 between the Venezuelan government and the British, and ultimately this arbitration, which is still brought up by the Guyanans and their supporters in the U.S. government to this day, arbitrated that the Essequibo region belonged to Guyana. Now, the Venezuelans, no matter what iteration of the Venezuelan state that we've been dealing with, have always rejected this. They have never accepted that 1899 verdict. They claim have claimed for over a century, in fact, that the arbitration was corrupt, that at least one of the representatives there, the Russian representative who was on that arbitration panel, was paid off by British imperialism. And that before even that, though, if we go back and look at what they were basing their arbitration on, part of what informed it was the fact that in the 1840s, the British hired a German explorer called Robert Herman Schomburg. And in 1840, he was paid by the British to establish a border in the area. And he drew the border line that we're now seeing this dispute about in 1840, violating an agreement that had been in place since 1815 that the Venezuelans thought they had with the British. So this borderline that you see, which constitutes the limits to which what was British Guyana claimed, is established by an explorer who was hired by the British. And the arbitration was basing some of its judgment, if you take the judgment seriously, on this Schomburg line from 1840, a guy who was paid by the British Empire. So again, like, this is a deeply corrupt process. The British have quite plainly, in the period where they had direct control over Guyana, never respected the territory of any of the Venezuelan republics, the first, the second, or the third, and they didn't respect the territorial integrity of Gran Colombia either. And then they engaged in what appeared to be a very corrupt arbitration process. Again, this wasn't settled by the arbitration in 1899. The story then rumbles on for another 40-odd years until you get the Venezuelans bringing it up again in the 1940s and then again in the 1960s. Now, the 1966 Geneva Agreement, and this is immediately before the British grant independence to what had been known as British Guyana. The Venezuelans then decided they wanted to raise this issue again, and what the Geneva Agreement says is that the previous arbitration of 1899 should be thrown out, and that the two countries should commit to settling the dispute in a peaceful manner. So the reason why the Venezuelan government mentions the 1966 Geneva Agreement isn't that that agreement gave them or acknowledged their claims over the Essequibo region. What it does is it throws out the 1899 arbitration result. So that's why the Venezuelans keep mentioning it. So the 1966 judgment there, or the agreement, shall we say, and the independence of Guyana are both crucial to mention, because when the Guyanan independence process was completed and Venezuela was asked to recognize the independence of Guyana, they recognized the independence of the new Guyanan government, but only within the borders of what had been established as British Guyana back in like the 1800s. So without the Essequibo region, and the Venezuelan government communicated this to the Guyanan government at the time, saying that they recognized these areas as independent, but would not recognize the Essequibo region as being part of this new Guyanan state. So that's crucial to bear in mind. There has never been a point under any Venezuelan government that they recognized Essequibo as being part of Guyana. Not in the 19th century, not in the 20th century, and not now. So this, to say that this is a new thing or that Maduro has just made it up, as some have intimated, this isn't true. It's a 200-year-old dispute going back to its origin, which is, of course, the British seizure of that place, of that region back in 1840, and their paying of a corrupt guy to draw a line on a map and claim that that was then theirs, essentially. So after 66, there's then a 12-year period known as the Port of Spain Protocol, which was meant to be a period where Venezuela and Guyana would settle the border disputes. Is another period where basically what happens is a series of controversies erupt because the Guyanans keep giving oil exploration rights in the coastal waters off the Essequibo region, which should be by, according to the Venezuelan government, their territorial waters. They keep giving them for oil exploration rights to American, Canadian companies mainly. So this collapses after 12 years in 1982, and then you get the so-called UN Good Offices process, which is where the UN Secretary General appointed a series of officers who were going to apparently arbitrate this dispute and come to a conclusion. And this ran for years and years and years, over a decade, and no result was ever reached. So you then go into the period of when the Venezuelan state is essentially refounded. And it's been refounded numerous times, but the latest occasion, of course, was 1999. And you get the Hugo Chavez era, which runs for 14 years from 1999 to 2013. Strange to think that he's been gone 10 years now. But Chavez in 2001 made a concerted effort between 2001 and 2004 to reach a settlement with Guyana. And he did this by telling the Guyanans, look, you can't, as they were planning to in 2001, have American military installations there. We're not going to accept that. We're also not going to accept you giving American companies the rights to exploit the resources of this region, which we regard as ours. However, what we are prepared to do, because Chavez was a Pan-Americanist, he was a Bolivarian in the truest sense of the term, in that he was a man who believed in building a Pan-American, South American and Central American nation. So he said to the Guyanans that, well, we're not prepared to have you give this land away to US oil companies and others. What we are prepared to do, though, is if you want to develop this in a way that benefits the people of the region, then we want to work with you to build this up and let's develop it together. Because remember, Chavez had this idea that he was pursuing, that the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela was just the first part. He looked back at the fall of Gran Colombia and he saw it as a great tragedy. And he wanted to work towards unity in South America, knowing and realizing quite correctly, as had Bolivar, of course, and then back into the middle part of the 20th century, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro both saw this as well, that a unified Southern American confederation of nations or some kind of unified state would be the answer to the historic weaknesses of the area. So Chavez, with that in mind, was inviting Guyana to work together to develop the Essequibo region and to keep out the imperialists. Now, this didn't go very far, though, because after about 2004, the siege on Venezuela starts to amp up. And the internal problems that Chavez had to deal with kind of dwarfed a long-running territorial dispute, and the whole thing just got left behind. So what's brought this back again is, of course, that the right-wing puppet regime of Irfan Ali, the current ruler of Guyana, has been giving away rights to explore and exploit the resources of Guyana, most importantly, the oil fields. And these, of course, include these fields in the Essequibo region, off the coast of the Essequibo region, which are being exploited by ExxonMobil. And according to some estimates, they're already extracting 340,000 barrels per day, making billions of dollars off of it, some of which they're throwing at the Guyanan government, most of which, of course, is pure profit. So Maduro and the Venezuelan government were faced with a situation where essentially not only are they going to lose this territory by default, because once the imperialists are well established there, then it's going to be very difficult to get them out. But also that the Guyanan regime is inviting more and more close collaborations with US imperialism, including inviting US imperialism to station more military assets in this disputed region. So then the Venezuelans will have the American military presence in Colombia, which is very well established and long running, on one side, and another set of hostile military installations on the other, and the Guyanan side. So again, this is an unacceptable reality that the Venezuelans aren't going to just sit there and take. It's because just because you have Gustavo Petro in the presidency of Colombia right now, well, another ultra-reactionary could come along any moment. There's been all kinds of coup plans against Petro, and he could lose by fair means or foul the next election. So there's all kinds of things going on. There's all kinds of motivations for the imperialists to try and get in there and militarize the Essequibo region. But essentially, I think what the imperialists are planning to do is, first of all, exploit the resources. And second of all, they've already turned Guyana into an effective puppet state. Try and ring Venezuela with military bases to try and increase the pressure on the Bolivarian Republic. So that's why the Venezuelans committed themselves to doing a referendum on this just the other week, where, of course, there was, as there usually is with these referendums and elections in Venezuela, a very high turnout, and the population voted in a consultative referendum not for annexation, but to essentially incorporate the Essequibo region properly into Venezuela, and that includes issuing identity cards, allowing the residents in the Essequibo region to become citizens of Venezuela. I think the idea that there was going to be a full-on military invasion is a bit overcooked in the bourgeois press. What Maduro keeps talking about is incorporation. So essentially may appeal to the population there to become Venezuelan nationals, try and bring the population along and demonstrate to them that life will be better for them inside Venezuela. And I think military action is the very last resort there. But I wouldn't rule it out completely, because if US imperialism insists on, which it will, trying to establish a military outpost there, then they're going to meet some kind of response from the Venezuelan government. Now, maybe that's what Maduro is going to go and talk to Putin about, trying to sound out his allies. We don't know. But the point to bear in mind is this. The original Venezuelan state, in all of its and all of its iterations that have followed, have all seen the Essequibo region as a integral part of the country, one that was taken away from them by the ineptitude, to a large degree, of the Venezuelan state in the 1840s, when they were unable to prevent the British arbitrarily drawing a line on a map and claiming it as their own. It has been kept in what was then British Guyana by a corrupt arbitration process in the 1890s. There have been numerous attempts by Venezuelan governments to deal with this problem all the way through the 20th century, all of which led to nothing, because there was always one imperialist power or another that didn't want the Essequibo region to go back to Venezuela and wanted to keep their hands on it one way or another, either directly in the form of British Guyana or by a control of the Guyanan government, which is what the British worked hard to keep after nominal independence. So how should we look at this then? Well, I think that the cartographical lesson that we've gone through in this particular part of the program shows us the claim of Venezuela is one that is as old as the Venezuelan state. it's not a case of imperialism by Venezuela or whatever else that the idiot left has decided to indulge in terms of explanations. What you have in Venezuela is a country that's going through a ongoing process of national liberation, which of course is an incomplete process from the time of Bolivar. So you have that process going on. You also have a workers' revolutionary process being pushed forward by the mass democratic participation of the Venezuelan workers and peasants in the government of the country. So to call this country imperialist is frankly a joke. If you are engaging in that kind of rhetoric, then you have no more right to call yourself a Marxist than Rishi Sunak does. So this is part of the national liberation process that Venezuela has been engaged in, that was renewed with the coming to office of Hugo Chavez and the beginning of the Bolivarian revolution. And this is a process which is now continuing. And the residents of the Essequibo region, apparently there is only around about 135,000 or so of them, according to one estimate. It's a very sparsely populated region. So the people there would be far better off incorporated into the Venezuelan state properly than they would being ruled by a Guyanan Zelensky, essentially, and being subject to the endless manipulations of US imperialism. The oil resources and the other resources, which apparently include gold deposits, would, if developed by the Venezuelan government, would be used to actually benefit the people of the region. Now, for all the siege that the Venezuelans have gone through over the last almost 20 years now, they have consistently improved life for the masses in Venezuela, and we can tell from the way in which this has been approached that they're sincere about extending that into the Essequibo region. So would the population there be better off in the Bolivarian Republic? Of course they would. They would be far better off there than under the Georgetown puppet regime. And we should remember, of course, that Maduro, even though I don't think even he would claim to have Chavez's talents, is as committed to the Pan-American unity that Chavez pursued and that was Bolivar's dream, as was the man himself. So it's a territorial dispute, but it's a territorial dispute that involves a country that's going through a revolutionary process. And in my view, it's a dispute in which we should back the Venezuelans, because without the Bolivarian revolution powering this process forward, not only would this be, of course, if the compradors in Venezuela succeeded, be an enormous setback for the country, an enormous setback for the development of the national liberation process in South America, which I emphasize again is an incomplete process. You just need to look at what happened in Peru recently with the overthrow of Castillo to show that this was a process which is interrupted perpetually by the actions of imperialism. So the actions of the Venezuelan government, backed with a clear mandate from the masses, is something that we should stand behind and in support of. And we should not accept the claims made by various so-called Western leftists that this is somehow an act of imperialism. It's not. It's the national liberation process in Venezuela being pushed forward. And it's being pushed forward by the masses in alliance with their government. And so that is the point I wanted to make, and I wanted to end this on. And I'll now turn to questions from the floor, so to speak. So, Banana Bender says, I think Maduro spoke with the US before deciding to go ahead with this vote. Well, they certainly tried. I mean, they did fight the case at the International Court of Justice, but one detail that I didn't mention in the presentation there was that the Guyanan legal bills, the government of Guyana's legal bills, were all paid for by ExxonMobil. So it gives you an indication as to who's benefiting here. Good evening to Martin, who's enjoying a day off. Good evening to Slava. And good evening to Jason, my comrade from the Class Consciousness Project. Football podcast from the project coming right up soon. Irish Partisan comments on the cartographical display and says the map from 1823 is shows the defeat of the Spanish at the Battle of Carabobo. Gran Colombia was finally independent. And also, don't forget that Guyana also gave us Jonestown. Yes, Jim Jones and his friends killed themselves in Guyana for some strange reason. I never really understood why old Jim decided to go down there to build his compound, but maybe that's a question for another day. Banana Bender says, some very odd questions around Jonestown, that's for sure. CIA certainly looked like they were involved. Wasn't Jim Jones a big fig in the California Democratic Party for a while? Importance of the area is oil, and other resources too. Yepex, I haven't checked that email address, but if you sent me one in there, I'll certainly look it up. Martin says, Banana Bender has a point, RE Jonestown. Looking at a map now, and Jonestown was deep in Essequibo, hard on the Venezuelan border. Interesting. Klavek says, Yankee go home, viva Bolivarian revolution, and that is the correct position. Banana Bender says, many great Peter Dale Scott acolytes on Twitter have gone over the oddities of Jonestown. Am I supposed to believe that the CIA aren't interested in one of the most insane cults in recent memory? I hope the new Gran Colombia includes the Great Lakes where I am, says Klavik. Well, maybe. Maybe there'll be a unified America stretching all the way from northern Canada all the way down to the Malvinas. Good evening to Heidi. Apparently it's Guyanese, not Guyanan. I've been mispronouncing it, or misnaming it, I should say. Philbin says, the border dispute, strong claims by Venezuela are clearly long-standing, referendum consistent with peaceful process despite the barking of US imperialists. Yep, very true. Yepex, the Class Consciousness Project is the project with which I am involved, which I will drop a link to the website in the chat about. So there we go. So you can take a look at it yourself. Tim says, thanks for the analysis and research. It was something I know very, very little about. Is the situation designed to allow a future US Trump regime the war in Latin America they've been looking for? Well, it's a good question, Tim. I mean, I've been looking at Venezuela militarily speaking. One of the reasons why they went for a state of siege and not an invasion was because Venezuela's defense is very, very strong. I mean, they don't have much of an air force or a navy, but they do have over 350,000 regular troops. The militia that they've got organized, the working class militia, stands at 3.5 million, which, and that in 2019, that was incorporated into the Venezuelan armed forces. So this arming of the working class and incorporating them into the armed forces is, of course, a revolutionary act. Now, the prospects of the US being able to invade Venezuela, therefore, with almost 4 million people under arms and willing to fight, that's going to be a tremendously difficult prospect, which they would find it very difficult to pull off. It would certainly result in an awful lot of US casualties, which is why they were desperate to get old Juan Guaido in there, stage some sort of internal coup. They hoped to collapse the Bolivarian revolutionary process from the inside, and none of that's worked so far. So if they were going to try and do some sort of war there, they'd need to undergo a vast military expansion, which may happen. So before they could hope to engage in some kind of direct invasion, they would need to vastly expand the US military. They would need to vastly expand their military production beyond what it's at now. They'd essentially need to revolutionize their industrial production inside the United States. I've made this point before, because invading Venezuela will be a very difficult task. And of course, before they can do any of those tasks inside the United States to build themselves a force that will be potentially capable of doing that kind of military campaign, they would need to crush the US working class first and foremost. So there'd be a lot that any US regime had to do before they could actually stand a chance of invading Venezuela and pulling it off. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to try something. Remember, all the way through the Trump era, there were multiple attempts by the US to try and stage some kind of commando raid. They tried to land like a bunch of ex-Green Berets, I believe it was, on the beaches in Venezuela. A lot of them just got immediately busted and arrested. So it's a very tense situation there. I don't think they can do a direct invasion, and I think the Venezuelan defense has been built up very successfully with the active assistance of the Russians, especially, but also the Iranians apparently have played a role in that too. So the again, the prospects there aren't great for the US in terms of an invasion. I think they're going to try some more internal destabilization first, but the impact of that has been lessening. The Venezuelan opposition are not popular, despite all the problems that Venezuela has gone through. The support for the PSUV and the revolutionary process is very, very strong. And the opposition candidates aren't popular and disgrace themselves by association with like Guaido and the attempted coup. So I think that the Venezuelan revolutionary process is fairly secure at the moment. So I wouldn't say that even if Trump gets in again and tries some kind of like ambitious move in the South American continent, it has very little chance of success if he fancies going to war with Venezuela. They'll probably lose. So Philbin says, do you think there's a chance for condominium autonomy, a shared territory between both populations, would be opposed by the US AOAS, of course? Well, that's what Chavez wanted. He wanted co-development of the territory between Guyana and Venezuela. So that was clearly the ideal position that the Venezuelans would have wanted. I think that what's been happening is that the Biden regime, of course, with ExxonMobil happy to roll with this, has been egging on this Irfan Ali guy, the president of Guyana, to try and escalate the situation. I think the US is working off essentially the same plans that they had with Ukraine and the same one that they've got at the moment with regard to Taiwan, which is that I don't think that they would be prepared to intervene directly against Venezuela. I think that what they maybe want would be to force the hand of Maduro into actually feeling like he had no choice but to stage a military or a special military operation, should we say, to take the area by force. Now, the Venezuelan military is not built for offensive operations, it's built for defensive operations, the defensive operation being mainly against the US, but also against a Colombian regime that would be headed by the likes of the former president Alvaro Uribe, the sort of arch comprador reactionary figure. So is it capable of staging an offensive operation? I assume that there has been some kind of military plan put in place for this kind of contingency. So my thoughts are that they would try. The US plan has been, I think, is to build up as far as they can Guyana, and then provoke a war with the Venezuelans, and then hope that such a war would destabilize Venezuela itself, and you get the rest of the picture. Slap on even more sanctions, and crucially, try and cut off Venezuela from trade and diplomatic relations with the rest of South America. Isolate it completely and hope that it collapses. That's what I think the plan of... Remember, Elliot Abrams works for the Biden administration just as he worked for Trump. And this kind of idea, I think, has his fingerprints and various others in the horrendous world of the DC think tank brigade. It's got their fingerprints on it, because I don't think that the Biden regime would want to risk US forces directly, other than, of course, their special death squad type forces. So what I think they would want to do is trigger a war, then try and isolate Venezuela even more, then try to ramp up internal tensions and exploit them, and hopefully cause a collapse of the government. What they keep underestimating is not Maduro himself, though he has proven far more adept a political maneuverer than the US would have given him credit for. But of course, it's the strength of feeling within the Venezuelan masses, within the working class and the peasantry. That's the strength of the Venezuelan revolution. It's in the masses, just as the strength of the Nicaraguan revolutionary process is in the masses. So given the way we know that US imperialism likes to wage war, I think the idea of them trying to run a proxy war against Venezuela and hoping to collapse what they would call the regime, that seems to be the plan they're working off. It hasn't worked in Ukraine, of course, and I think that one of the things that Maduro will be going and talking to Putin about is this very thing, how to overcome this. The advice that he will be getting from Putin, I don't claim to be on the Kremlin mailing list, and is probably going to be along the lines of resolve it peacefully if you possibly can. According to the website that brings a lot of reliable news from Venezuela, that's the Orinoco Tribune, the Guyanan government has agreed to more negotiations. So perhaps they've been sort of stunned into or shocked into agreeing to further direct talks about the region. Again, as Philbin's comment makes clear, I agree with this, which is that Chavez's original plan should be the preference here. However, the Guyanan government seems to be completely controlled by Washington. So if Washington says, if Elliot Abrams sends some horrendous colonial representative down there and says, no, you've got to stand firm, don't concede anything, don't worry, we've got your back, then will this President Ali in Guyana do anything other than pull a Zelensky? We don't know. Banana Bender says, should the Esquibo residents get a vote on whom they will they join or remain? Apparently Venezuela will annex it following a national vote. Well, again, Maduro is not talking about annexation. He's talking about incorporation. We'll see what that means in reality in due time. But I think that, to reiterate the point, I think that shared development of the area with an idea that eventually the old Gran Colombia is going to be re-established, hopefully, or some version of it will be re-established, and the whole place becomes one confederated state again. That is clearly the preference of the Venezuelans. If there's going to be a war, it'll be a war that is provoked by the US imperialists. So I think that the Russians, particularly, who are the closest ally of Venezuela, I think, but also the Iranians and the Chinese slightly further in the background, will all say, well, negotiate, but if you do have to go for it, well, the Chinese won't back the Venezuelans up directly. They'll just say, we believe in negotiations over and over and over again, whilst continuing to provide Venezuela with a lot of economic support. The Russians will probably back them. The Iranians will probably back them. So with that in mind, if a fight is forced, I think that the Venezuelans will probably wrap it up quite quickly. We should all hope, though, that one isn't forced, and that either Irfan Ali awakes, looks at Ukraine and thinks, yeah, I don't fancy that being my fate, and then we can hopefully see the original plan of Chavez be gone back to. Yep X says, did you hear that former Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori has been released from prison? Yes, a benefit for him and his wretched family of the coup and the coup regime of Dina Boluarte, which is, again, wholly controlled by US imperialism. They've released their old servant from prison. Iris Partizan asks, what role do you think Lula will play? I think he will want a negotiated settlement. I don't think, for all the questions that are valid to raise about Lula and the PT in Brazil, I don't think that he would want to see the US running a proxy war on his northern border. So I think that his offer of mediation is quite genuine. Perhaps it will lead to positive results, and the willingness of compradors in South America to throw themselves, or more accurately, throw their people into a trap run on behalf of US imperialism is astonishing to me. But I guess I shouldn't be surprised by anything now. Hopefully, if there is mediation by the Brazilian government, then it leads to a settlement. I mean, I doubt the Venezuelans actually want a war here. But again, they don't want to see this territory, which is, again, always been regarded as integral to the Venezuelan state, to be taken over and militarized and exploited by US imperialism. They're not prepared to have that done. And, well, why should they be? So, US neocon plan for Venezuela sounds like Ukraine 2.0. Yes, and with Taiwan as Ukraine 3.0. Philbin says, despite undeserved success in Peru, US imperialist machinations in Western Hemisphere have been especially bumbling in recent years. The people of South and Central America and Caribbean keep standing up. Well, we can only hope that this one fails as well, but you are correct. Their ability to pull off the kind of things they used to do in the 60s and the 70s and earlier has lessened in recent years because, of course, the peoples of this region who have been subjected to the horrific crimes of US imperialism have learnt very important lessons from this. And the most important lesson is that compared to the mobilization of the masses of any country, the power of US imperialism dwindles away. Klavik says, because Jesus is a Marxist. Well, you want to get into that one, we could be here all night. But certainly there's very interesting theories on that. DE says, same old tricks. Yep, referring to US imperialism. Ryan Nash says, during the Cold War, Guyana was aligned with the socialist world. In fact, one of their nominal independence founders, Yagan, praised Mao and Stalin. Did their position on the area differ then? And should we take anything from this historical example? Well, I would say that one of the things that the British had as their objectives was the destruction of the early socialist independence leaders and the bringing over of Guyana to be firmly under the control of US and British imperialism again. They were committed to the negotiation process, but this collapsed in the 70s when, I don't know exactly when the British succeeded in getting rid of the original socialist leaders, but by the 70s they were already giving a lot of concessions to imperialism in the form of the oil companies. So I don't think that socialist period lasted a very long time due to the machinations of imperialism. I think maybe it's a thing for a future episode to go into what happened to Guyana post-independence, because that's an important thing to cover. So I'll make a note to go back to that next week. James Graham says, Syria is an ally to Caracas, which is true. Can't wait for the Venezuelan diaspora opinions, says Banana Bender. Well, they'll be torn because they won't want to look as if they oppose it, but they probably will end up opposing it and declaring that Maduro is the Putin of South America, which, given Putin's reputation now in most of the world, is probably more of a compliment than an insult. Martin asks, what is the difference between annexation and incorporation? From what I can tell, and this is just off the Venezuelan government's own website, they're saying that they're not planning to march in there and annex it right now. They're planning to offer citizenship to anybody who's in the region that wants it. And essentially their aim seems to be to bring the people of the region over to their side via political persuasion at this point. The whole question of what makes that distinction, I think that annexation would imply a direct military operation. If their plan is to win over the population there, hopefully bring them over to be citizens of Venezuela, and then try and incorporate the region because they can say, well, the overwhelming majority of them are now citizens of Venezuela, maybe that's their plan. I don't know. Until we have a clear idea of what's going to happen here, it's hard to say what the difference is. But annexation to me implies direct military takeover. Incorporation to me implies a longer process of political persuasion of the population. That's what Maduro seems to be saying in a speech that he gave this week. Did you hear anything about Brazil building up troops on the border? So asks Dingo Ate Me Baby. I have heard about it. I haven't seen confirmation on it. Yep, X says, will Venezuela ever be strong enough to fight off US imperialism and interference? They've successfully fought off US imperialism for 20 years. Bear in mind, the first coup was 21 years ago. So there's been they've been successfully resisting US imperialism for over 2 decades. So the question is, can they break out of the siege that US imperialism has put on their country? And I think they can. I think that they will, with the assistance of their allies. And also if Brazil takes more of an independent line, and which it is under Lula, and stops the Bolsonaro policy, which I think it largely has done, but I'm not sure on the up-to-date version of the policy of what they're doing with regard to US sanctions. if the rest of the South American countries decide they're just going to ignore all US sanctions, particularly Brazil, and if Venezuela can rely on assistance with regard to making purchases internationally, with regard to being part of a financial system which isn't dominated by US imperialism, the question of their sovereignty can be secured. Again, as I say, the national liberation process in South America has not been completed. It's an ongoing process. So as that process advances, then the prospects for a sovereign independent state in Venezuela and a wider Pan-American project will advance with it. Irish Partisan says, speaking of compradors in Latin America, we have one with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who today called for US imperialism to continue on their proxy war in Ukraine. Tikhanovskaya works for the Atlantic Council, which is, of course, the Atlantic Council is a creation of and run by US imperialism. So, yeah, this is of course, the Belarusian comprador, or wannabe comprador, who apparently has been living on handouts from the EU and the US imperialists. Thankfully, and I think we should all be thankful for this, Lukashenko was well supported enough and held firm in 2020, because God knows what would have happened if that group of, there's no other word to describe the Belarusian compradors as traitorous scum, because they would have asset stripped the country and cast it into a pit of hell by agreeing to turn it into an armed encampment of US imperialism. So we should all be thankful that they didn't succeed in that endeavor. And apparently now Tikhanovskaya and co are going to have difficulty renewing their passports, as old Lucas says you've got to go back to Belarus to renew it. And all these people are wanted, quite rightly, for arrest in Belarus. Banana Bender says, Chedai Jagan, not sure whom, but one was overthrown by the Brits. Ryan says, so their foreign policy rapidly, even with some socialist offices initially, becomes dominated by British imperialism. Makes sense, thanks. I'll be interested in that for an episode. I'm going to make a note of it. It's as Lenin pointed out in his introduction to Bukharin's work on imperialism, that he makes a point, and Bukharin makes it himself in the text, but Lenin makes it better, that having natural resources, which Guyana does, I mean, I believe they've got certain agricultural resources, including sugar, even just in the borders of the undisputed bit of Guyana. Having natural resources doesn't mean a lot unless you have the ability to extract them, develop them into a product, and if you need to exchange it, to sell it on the world market. If you lack the ability to do any of those things, and if you lack an ally, a more powerful ally who can assist you in building up your industrial capacity, then you're going to be in a very difficult situation. And so this is why a lot of the weaker post-independence governments that weren't able to rely on the Soviets or the Chinese for support, they ended up reverting back to an alliance or a submissive role with regard to imperialism. Because it, as again, Kwame Nkrumah points it out in his work on neocolonialism, without the ability to sell your goods into the world market, if you're trying to raise revenue, trying to grow the economy, you're tremendously restricted. Or the ability to, again, work with the socialist bloc countries, as the DPRK did back in the day. So this is why you end up with a country like Guyana that's very small and very weak, when its original independence leaders are either overthrown or pushed to one side, reverting back to collaborating with imperialism again, because imperialism comes in and dangles a bit of money in front of them and says, well, you let us exploit this region, we'll pay you a few billion. Yeah, we'll pay you, what, 3% of the revenue and keep 97% of it, but it's more than you're getting now. Again, like, these are the difficulties facing countries who became independent, especially in areas that are completely dominated by imperialism. It's very difficult to build your way out of that, particularly if you're leading a government that might be social democratic, but has large pro-capitalist elements in it, hasn't broken with capitalism, still wants to sell its goods on the world market. Well, that world market is dominated by imperialism. And if you're trying to sell in their market, they're going to insist on all kinds of concessions being made to them. And this is the perennial problem. Without the socialist bloc, there was no alternative for a lot of these countries. It's only with the growth of the power of China, now the power of Russia, that economic alternatives start to present themselves. So US imperialism will now be challenged more and more, precisely because these alternative routes to economic development now exist, which leaves open the road for more socialist projects in smaller countries. Okay. Banana Bender says, looks like Venezuela just got a cricket team. Well, they'll probably be better than England. Yep, X, okay. I'm glad you like the answer to the question. Dingo Ate Me Baby asks, can you get a copy of Jyoti Bra's speech at CPI Anti-Imperialist Conference in Seattle and play it? You mean put it on the channel? I haven't seen it yet. I don't know whether it's actually up. I'll check for it, and if it's available, I'll share it. There's a chapter on Guyana in William Bloom's Killing Hope. Right, I'll make a note of that, Martin. Thanks for that suggestion. Irish Partisan says, latest news, the Russians have re-entered Rabotina, which they lost back in July. Yeah, I haven't had time to go into the details of the Russian events tonight. We've been talking about the Esquibo case. So I'll come back to Ukraine and Russia tomorrow. We are looking more and more like we're entering the end game now, though quite how long that lasts is another question. And Putin is, of course, as he announced today, running again for the presidency. I don't think there was ever much doubt about that, but we will cover that tomorrow too. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. The full show, unedited, will be out on Patreon later tonight. The front section of this video, which deals with the Esquibo case, will be going out as its own video separate to that. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight and contributed to the discussion. Always appreciated. And I'll be back with you again with a focus on Russia and Ukraine and other related matters tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out.